Welcome to today's deep dive. We are so glad you were here with us because, well, I want you to imagine something. Imagine being in a candlelit, fog-covered room in London.
Oh, the classic Victorian aesthetic, right?
Exactly, it's 1862, and you are sitting around this heavy wooden table with some of the absolute greatest minds of the era.
We're talking decorated chemists, high-ranking clergymen, literary
Yeah,
giants.
the real intellectual elite. And they are gathered strictly to talk about the dead.
Which is such a wild concept for that specific group of people.
Right. But before we get into the origins of history's most exclusive paranormal society, I want to jump ahead to 1920 for a second to hook you in.
Oh, I know where you're going with this. The fairy incident.
Yes, the Fury incident.
Yeah.
So the man who created Sherlock Holmes, fiction's ultimate enduring symbol of pure, cold, calculating logic.
Right.
Well, he publicly staked his towering international reputation on the existence of fairies.
And just to be clear, he wasn't making a metaphorical point about, like, the magic of nature or something.
No, not at all. Arthur Conan Doyle, literally one of the most celebrated minds of his generation, he looked at a photograph of a children's paper cutout.
A cutout propped up in the grass with a hat pin, I might add.
Yeah, a literal hat pin. And he declared it to be absolute scientific proof of multidimensional winged humanoids.
It honestly remains one of the most stunning intellectual collapses in modern history.
It really does.
I mean, people still marvel at how the architect of the world's greatest deductive detective could be so thoroughly, completely fooled.
Fooled by an illusion that, frankly, wouldn't trick a modern 10-year-old today.
Right.
So we are going to explore exactly how that happened today, but we aren't just looking at Conan Doyle, because, his story is really just the final tragic chapter of a much larger, much darker history.
We have this fascinating historical document detailing the origins of this highly secretive organization, the one formed in London in 1862.
The Ghost Club.
Exactly, the Ghost Club. And their mission was entirely unprecedented. They wanted to take the scientific method, the exact same empirical rigor they were using to map out chemistry and biology, and apply it directly to the afterlife.
They literally wanted to put ghosts under a microscope.
They did. And our mission here for you today isn't just to recount spooky campfire tales. We are exploring a profound historical intersection.
Right, because this is where rigorous scientific minds tried to figure out the great beyond. Okay, let's unpack this, because I am so interested to hear about the Ghost Club, but I kind of struggle to understand the premise.
How so?
Well, to understand why a group of elite, decorated chemists and clergymen are hiding in a smoky room in 1862 hunting for phantoms, we have to understand the sheer violent whiplash of being alive in the 19th century.
Oh, absolutely. The Victorian mind was forged in a crucible of extraordinary contradiction. To really get the Ghost Club, you have to understand the ground they were standing on.
Which was shifting rapidly, right?
Very rapidly. The 19th century was this explosive, unprecedented age of scientific progress. It systematically dismantled centuries of received wisdom.
You look at the timeline, and it really is an avalanche. You have the perfection of the steam engine, which it doesn't just change transportation.
No, it fundamentally alters the human relationship with time and geography.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the telegraph. In 1858, they lay the first transatlantic telegraph cable. Practically overnight, the concept of distance is annihilated.
You can send a message from London to New York in minutes instead of weeks.
That must have felt like absolute magic to the average citizen.
It really felt like human beings were suddenly claiming the powers of the divine. And, that was just the infrastructure. The medical and biological revelations were even more destabilizing.
Oh, like germ theory.
Exactly. The early foundations of germ theory are beginning to take hold. For centuries, the brightest medical minds believed diseases were caused by miasma.
Miasma, like bad air, right?
Right. Bad air, or imbalances in bodily humors. Suddenly, science is proving that invisible, microscopic entities, completely unseen by the naked eye, are the actual vectors of illness and death.
So the visible world is real, it's just populated by microbes instead of demons.
Precisely. And then, the absolute hammer blow to the Victorian worldview drops in 1859.
Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species.
Yes. That single text completely upended the bedrock of Western civilization. For centuries, the biblical narrative of creation provided a very secure, unquestionable framework for human existence.
Humans were special, created by a divine hand, placed at the center of a purposeful universe.
But Darwin introduced a mechanism, a natural selection, that suggested human beings were merely the product of line and different biological processes over millions of years.
So the rational material world is expanding at this breathtaking pace. They're mapping out the stars, the microbes, the origins of life itself.
But there's a cost to all that mapping.
Right, because when you strip away the mysteries of the universe one by one, when the lightning is just electricity, the plague is just a bacteria, and human beings are just advanced primates, you create a massive psychological vacuum.
You rob people of the cosmic comfort that there is a grand divine plan. And nature abhors a vacuum, but the human psyche abhors it even more.
That makes a lot of sense.
When science begins loudly proclaiming this material world is all there is, and when your physical body degrades, you are simply extinguished, well, people rebel.
I don't want to hear that.
Exactly. The rapid expansion of the rational, measurable world triggered a desperate, almost violent societal need for the mystical.
Which explains the other side of this Victorian contradiction.
Uh.
At the exact same time that Darwin and the Telegraph are taking over the world, you have the explosive boom of spiritualism.
The timing is not a coincidence.
I read the background on this,
Okay.
and I try to relate it to modern times. It feels equivalent to living in an age of AI and quantum computing, but simultaneously seeing a massive mainstream resurgence in astrology or crystal healing.
That's a great analogy. And the scale of the spiritualist movement is difficult for modern minds to grasp. It began in the United States in the late 1840s.
With the Fox sisters, right.
In New York.
Yeah, the Fox sisters. They claimed they could communicate with a spirit through a series of mysterious rapping sounds. And from that tiny cabin, it spread like a contagion across the globe.
Wow.
By the 1860s, spiritualism wasn't just a fringe hobby for a few eccentric individuals. It was a massive cultural force with its own economy, its own literature, its own touring celebrities.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about this scientific vacuum creating a need for the mystical, but I struggle to buy that a highly educated Victorian would suddenly start paying mediums to talk to ghosts just because of the steam engine.
That's a fair point.
Like, wasn't there something far more personal, far more visceral driving this industry? Was spiritualism just for the eccentric and the desperate?
You are identifying the dark engine of the entire movement.
Yeah.
Mortality.
The intellectual shock of Darwin was a luxury for the academic class, but the visceral reality of the 1800s was death. Mortality rates were staggering.
Yeah, a devastating percentage of children died before the age of 5 from diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, cholera.
And you have the American Civil War and the Crimean War producing unimaginable numbers of casualties. Almost every single family in the Western world was carrying a profound, unresolved grief.
So a grieving mother isn't going to a seance because she's pondering the philosophical implications of natural selection.
No, definitely not.
She's going because her 7-year-old died of cholera last week, and the local medium says she can hear the child's voice for a small fee.
And grief-stricken families paid handsomely just to hear that voice. That is the tragedy at the center of this era. Vulnerable, shattered people were desperate for any empirical proof that their loved ones still existed somewhere.
And because there was so much emotional desperation and so much money changing hands, spiritualism became a massive industry.
Exactly. And where there is a massive industry fueled by desperation, there are spectacular hoaxes.
Let's talk about those hoaxes because the mechanics of how they pulled this off in the 1860s are honestly fascinating. The sources detail phenomena like table rapping.
Right. Where a group sits around a heavy wooden table, asks a question, and the spirit supposedly answers by knocking on the wood from the great beyond.
But the reality was a bit different.
The reality of table rapping was often profoundly physiological, not supernatural. The Fox sisters, who originated the craze, were eventually revealed to be creating the knocking sounds themselves.
How would they do it?
By dislocating and cracking their toe joints against the wooden floorboards.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly clever, though.
Other mediums utilized concealed mechanisms in their shoes, or they simply relied on the ideomotor effect, where the subconscious, minute muscle movements of the expectant participants actually caused the table to tilt or shift without anyone consciously pushing it.
And then you have spirit photography, which was wildly lucrative. A grieving widow would pay an absolute fortune to a photographer, sit for a portrait, and when the glass plate was developed.
There would be a faint, translucent, ghostly face hovering right over her shoulder.
It's so predatory. How were they faking the photos back then?
William Mumler was one of the pioneers of this fraud in the 1860s. He utilized the wet collodion photographic process. It was complex and required preparing a glass plate with chemicals in a darkroom immediately before exposure.
Okay.
The fraud was basically achieved through double exposure. The photographer would pre-expose a glass plate with a faint image of an assistant dressed in a shroud, or even a stolen photograph of the deceased.
Wait, a stolen photo?
Yes, and when the actual client sat for their portrait, that same glass plate was exposed a second time. The result was a seemingly impossible image of the living sitting side by side with the dead.
So this specific cultural friction between the cold, hard, expanding world of rigorous science on one side and the desperate, messy, heavily exploited belief of the spiritualist movement on the other, this is the exact soil that birthed the Ghost Club.
It is.
They looked at this massive cultural phenomenon. They saw the grieving widows being bled dry by con artists, and they asked, is there a single genuine anomaly hidden in all this fraud?
Exactly. And to track the genesis of the club, we have to step out of the public theaters and into the insular world of academia. The formal Ghost Club in London didn't just materialize out of thin air in 1862.
Right, it started earlier.
Its roots trace back to the early 1850s, to Cambridge University. It began as the Cambridge Ghost Society, spearheaded by academics and theologians like Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton John Anthony Hort.
Okay, so these aren't marginalized eccentrics. These are men who would later become towering figures in biblical scholarship.
Exactly. They are the intellectual elite of the British Empire, deeply trained in rigorous thought, textual analysis, and evidence gathering.
They recognized that simply ignoring the spiritualist phenomenon wasn't a scientific approach. They wanted to take these claims and examine them with a real method.
Right. They sought to gather first-hand accounts, cross-examine witnesses, and evaluate the data free from religious dogmatism or theatrical hysteria. And by 1862, those informal academic networks cohered into a formalized, highly exclusive entity based in London.
But the defining characteristic of this newly formed Ghost Club was its intense, almost paranoid secrecy. The historical sources note that they kept incredibly scant records of their meetings.
Very scant.
They didn't publish their membership lists. It feels like they were acting less like a scientific society and more like an underground resistance movement.
Well, the sociological stakes required that level of secrecy. A prominent Victorian intellectual simply could not discuss the serious investigation of ghosts publicly without risking complete professional and social ruin.
The cultural vice grip was immense.
It was. On one side of that vice, you have the scientific establishment, the Royal Society, the institutional universities. If a decorated chemist announces he is spending his weekends tracking down poltergeists, the scientific community doesn't applaud his open-mindedness.
They excommunicate him. He loses his credibility, his funding, his social standing.
He becomes a laughingstock. The scientific consensus of the era was rigid materialism. Anything that smacked of the supernatural was viewed as a regression to the Dark Ages.
But the pressure from the other side of the vice grip was arguably even more dangerous.
The religious establishment.
Right. I imagine the Church of England in the 1860s didn't take kindly to a bunch of academics trying to bypass the clergy to chat directly with the deceased.
To the powerful religious institutions of Victorian England, attempting to contact the dead wasn't merely unscientific, it was profound heresy.
Wow.
The prevailing theological doctrine dictated that the souls of the departed were in the hands of God. The idea that a soul could be summoned back to a London drawing room to knock on a table was considered a demonic deception.
So you have the scientists calling them fools and the church calling them sinners.
Exactly. So they dim the lights, they lock the doors, and they keep no public ledgers, because what happens at the Ghost Club has to stay at the Ghost Club.
It was the only environment where they could actually speak freely.
And that shared vulnerability is perfectly encapsulated by the moniker they used for one another behind those closed doors. They didn't use academic titles. They addressed each other as Brother Ghost.
Brother Ghost. You know, that phrase is so deeply layered. It speaks to a very specific kind of fraternal intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
They are brothers in this highly stigmatized, dangerous intellectual quest. But it also acknowledges their shared obsession. It feels half-joking, a self-deprecating nod to how absurd their mission might look to the outside world.
But beneath the joke, it is deeply earnest.
Yeah. It is an acknowledgement that every single one of them sitting at that heavy wooden table was haunted by their own inescapable curiosity.
What's fascinating here is who exactly was sitting at this highly exclusive table. The membership of that secret fraternity challenges almost every assumption we might have about early paranormal investigators.
Because the people willing to adopt the title Brother Ghost were not gullible followers.
No, they weren't, and the most prominent example of that is one of the club's early defining members, Charles Dickens.
Now, when you listening hear the name Charles Dickens, you immediately associate him with the supernatural. He is the author of A Christmas Carol.
He gave the world Ebenezer Scrooge and the ghost of Jacob Marley wrapped in his heavy iron chains. He essentially defined the aesthetic of the modern ghost story.
Right, so a casual observer would naturally assume that a novelist who spent that much time rendering phantoms and spirits in his fiction must have been a massive true believer in his private life.
But the historical reality is the exact opposite. Charles Dickens was a pointed, ruthless, hardcore skeptic.
I read some of the excerpts from his magazine, Household Words, from the early 1850s, and his disdain for the spiritualist movement is palpable.
He explicitly stated that all accounts of haunted houses must be received with the greatest circumspection and sifted with the utmost care.
He didn't just doubt the mediums, he actively despised them.
Dickens was a fierce advocate for the working class and the vulnerable. He viewed the spiritualist industry as a deeply distasteful, predatory exploitation of grief.
Because he saw con artists using cheap parlor tricks to bleed money out of desperate mourning people.
Exactly. He aggressively mocked the commercialization of seances, referring to the entire phenomenon as the spirit business.
The spirit business.
Yeah, and he frequently collaborated with other prominent skeptics, like his close friend, the physicist Michael Faraday, who had publicly debunked the mechanics of table turning.
Which poses a massive logical puzzle for you to consider. If Dickens hated the paranormal industry with such vitriol, and if he was such a hardened public skeptic, why on earth was he risking his reputation as the most famous novelist in the English language to sit in secret with the Ghost Club?
It's a great question.
Why spend your evenings looking for the exact thing you just mocked in print?
Dickens' presence at the table really represents the absolute pinnacle of intellectual honesty. He despised the charlatans, and he hated the fraud, but he possessed a fundamental, unrelenting curiosity about the human experience.
He didn't want to dismiss the entire concept of the unknown just because the current practitioners were frauds.
Right. He was willing to sit at the table to ask the question, what if, underneath the mountains of deception, there is a single, genuine grain of truth?
He was seeking an anomaly. He's essentially saying, I am 99.9% sure the guy making the table float is a grifter with a pulley system in his shoe, but I care enough about the underlying architecture of the universe to actually test the claim.
And that empirical mandate defined the club's early methodology. They didn't just sit in comfortable armchairs debating the philosophy of the soul. They demanded that the supernatural submit itself to physical, rigorous testing.
They actively went out and did field work, which I love.
Yes. And the most incredible example of this field work involves their investigation of the Davenport brothers.
Okay, set the scene for us. Who are the Davenport brothers?
Ira and William Davenport were American illusionists who became the absolute rock stars of the spiritualist movement in the 1860s. They crossed the Atlantic and packed massive theaters across all of England,
Presenting themselves not as magicians, but as genuine mediums capable of manifesting physical spiritual phenomena.
Exactly. And their signature act was known as the Spirit Cabinet. The mechanics of this illusion are just brilliant.
Walk us through it.
The brothers are brought out onto a brightly lit stage in front of hundreds of people. They invite volunteers from the audience to physically bind them with thick ropes, securing their wrists, arms, and legs with incredibly complex knots.
Knots that the audience themselves tied.
Right. Once entirely immobilized, the brothers were placed inside a large, custom-built walnut cabinet. Inside this cabinet were various musical instruments, guitars, violins, tambourines, heavy brass bells. The doors of the cabinet were then sealed shut, plunging the bound brothers into total darkness.
The audience watches this locked box, and within seconds, the claim is that the spirits arrive. From inside the sealed cabinet, the audience suddenly hears the guitar being strummed. The bells ring frantically.
Sometimes, phantom hands would even appear through small apertures cut into the cabinet doors, tossing instruments out onto the stage.
The implication, heavily pushed by their promoters, was that since the brothers were securely tied with complex knots, sometimes known as the tomfool's knot, which tightens when pulled, they could not possibly be playing the instruments themselves.
Therefore, invisible spiritual entities must be manifesting physical force inside the box.
And the crowds were mesmerized. People were weeping, fainting, completely awestruck by what they perceived as undeniable proof of life after death. So what does the Ghost Club do?
They decide to investigate, and they don't buy a ticket to the theater to watch from the stalls. They arrange a private, highly controlled examination of the Davenport brothers.
They applied the parameters of a scientific experiment to a theatrical stage show. The members of the club examined the architecture of the cabinet.
They scrutinize the acoustic properties of the wood. They carefully analyze the specific methods used to tie the ropes, observing the tension and the slack.
They act as 19th century mythbusters, applying intellectual rigor to a phenomenon that the rest of society either blindly accepted or entirely ignored.
And after applying this intense, microscopic intellectual rigor, what is their conclusion? The Ghost Club concluded, unequivocally, that there were no spirits present in the Davenport cabinet.
They completely dismantled the claim.
They recognized that the brothers possessed extraordinary physical dexterity. They were highly skilled escape artists who had mastered the ability to slip out of their bindings in the pitch black, manipulate the instruments at lightning speed, and slip back into the ropes before the cabinet doors were open.
The club acknowledged their immense skill as performers, but declared that the dead remained perfectly quiet.
This investigation showcases the Ghost Club at its absolute peak. They are occupying the most difficult, uncomfortable middle ground you can hold in society.
Taking the question seriously enough to investigate, while refusing to simply believe the performance.
It is far easier to adopt an extreme position. It's easy to be the cynical debunker who refuses to look at the evidence out of arrogance, and it's easy to be the blind believer who refuses to question the evidence out of desperation.
But the early Ghost Club chose the grueling path of empirical verification, and they applied that grueling methodology on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend.
The surviving archival data reveals that over the years, the club didn't just debunk a few famous stage acts. They amassed an enormous collection of data, compiling over 2,000 documented cases of apparitions, hauntings, and supernatural phenomena.
2,000 accounts. That represents a monumental feat of archival effort. They didn't just collect newspaper clippings. They sought out the primary witnesses.
They conducted extensive interviews, cross-examining individuals about lighting conditions, physical states of mind, environmental factors, and the presence of independent corroboration.
And given their skeptical methodology, they threw out the vast majority of those cases. They recognized the mundane explanations.
Right, they dismissed cases as marsh gas or the settling of old timber or instances of sleep paralysis, which we now know causes terrifying visual hallucinations.
They documented cases of sheer pareidolia, where the human brain desperately seeks patterns and faces in random shadows.
They essentially acted as a filtration system, stripping away the fraud, the natural phenomena, and the psychological anomalies.
But the philosophical weight of their archive resides in what was left over after that massive filtration process. Because, the math is what makes this fascinating. I want you to think about the math.
Right, let's break it down.
Imagine those 2,000 cases. Let's assume that 99% of them were entirely explainable. Fraud, grief, bad lighting, whatever. 99% completely dismissed. What do you do with the remaining 1%?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a 1% anomaly rate leaves you with 20 cases.
20 documented, rigorously investigated cases that stubbornly resist any logical, scientific, or environmental explanation. You have the sharpest academic minds in London, men who understand physics and chemistry, staring at 20 accounts of the impossible, completely stumped.
And this is why we witness the profound intellectual humility of the Ghost Club. To their credit, they didn't pretend to have an answer for that 1%. They just kept collecting data.
When an institution is faced with an unexplainable anomaly, the instinct is usually to force a conclusion.
Right. Dogmatic scientists will invent a convoluted excuse to write off the anomaly. Dogmatic believers will instantly declare the anomaly to be definitive proof of their specific ghost.
But the Ghost Club refused to do either. They looked at the unexplainable data, and they sat with the deep unease of the unknown. They kept the files open.
However, human nature is not built to sustain that kind of suspended judgment indefinitely. Sitting with inconclusive data is psychologically exhausting. And as the decades passed, the membership shifted, and not everyone possessed the emotional fortitude to remain in that uncomfortable middle ground.
Which brings us to the scientific scandals of the club. Because when highly rational, incredibly educated minds fall into the trap of true belief, they fall spectacularly. I want to look specifically at Sir William Crookes.
Sir William Crookes was not a fringe academic. He was a figure of towering credibility in Victorian science.
He was a distinguished chemist, right?
A pioneer in vacuum tubes, inventing the Crookes tube, which was foundational for the later discovery of electrons and X-rays. He discovered the element thallium. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, publisher of Chemical News.
He is a man whose entire life was dedicated to absolute, empirical, measurable physical laws. He is the literal embodiment of the scientific establishment.
You'd think if anyone is immune to the cheap tricks of a Victorian seance room, it should be the guy discovering elements on the periodic table.
Exactly. But in the early 1870s, Crookes steps forward and makes an announcement that essentially paralyzes the scientific community. He declares that through rigorous testing, he has proven the existence of a new energy in nature, which he called a psychic force.
Crookes genuinely believed he had built scientific instruments capable of measuring the supernatural. He designed complex apparatuses to physically weigh the telekinetic force emitted by a medium.
And the medium he chose for his most famous series of experiments was a teenage girl named Florence Cook.
Florence Cook was a young, highly charismatic medium who claimed an extraordinary ability. She didn't just rap on tables. She claimed that during her seances, while she was tied up inside a cabinet, she could manifest a full-body, physical, breathing spirit who went by the name Katie King.
A full physical manifestation. And Crookes, the brilliant chemist, brings Florence Cook into his home laboratory.
Right. He hooks her up to galvanic batteries to supposedly ensure she can't leave the cabinet without breaking an electrical circuit.
And yet, during these sessions, the figure of Katie King steps out of the cabinet. She walks around the room. Crookes claimed he touched her, took her pulse, and even photographed her.
He threw the full weight of his elite scientific reputation behind this teenage girl, declaring Katie King to be a genuine spiritual entity.
The fallout was catastrophic for his reputation. The broader scientific community looked at the evidence and reached a much simpler conclusion. Florence Cook, a clever teenager, had completely outmaneuvered one of the greatest scientists alive.
The theories on how she did it are wild. Some suggest she simply learned how to bypass his electrical circuits, slipped out of her ropes, and walked around the room pretending to be the ghost, exploiting the dim lighting and Crookes' own notoriously poor eyesight.
Others suggest there was an accomplice, or even that Crookes, who spent hours locked in dark rooms with this young woman, was compromised by a romantic infatuation.
Regardless of the exact mechanism of the trick, the incident became one of the greatest scientific scandals of the age. It demonstrated a terrifying truth. Being an expert in chemistry does not make you an expert in deception.
Crookes assumed that because he was brilliant in a laboratory, he could easily spot a fraud. But Florence Cook wasn't playing by the rules of chemistry. She was playing the rules of psychological manipulation.
The Crookes scandal was a harbinger of a massive shift in the Ghost Club's DNA. Charles Dickens eventually passes away, taking his fierce, protective skepticism with him.
The club goes quiet for a period, and when it is revived in 1882, it is resurrected by a fundamentally different kind of mind, a clergyman named William Stainton Moses.
William Stainton Moses completely abandoned the difficult middle ground. He was a dyed-in-the-wool true believer. Under his influence, the rigorous skepticism that defined the early club was largely replaced by sheer credulity.
Moses became a massive champion of a phenomenon known as automatic writing. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, it's a practice where an individual enters a supposedly trance-like state, holds a pen to paper, and allows their hand to move entirely without conscious direction.
The claim is that a spirit has taken over their motor functions to deliver detailed messages from the great beyond.
Moses produced volumes of this automatic writing, claiming it contained profound theological revelations. But his credulity wasn't limited to his own writings. He also heavily endorsed the most notoriously fraudulent practice of the era, spirit photography.
This is where the psychology of belief becomes incredibly uncomfortable to analyze. Moses fiercely championed a specific French spirit photographer named Edouard Isidore Bouguer.
He pointed to Bouguer's photographs as undeniable, objective proof of the afterlife.
But in 1875, Bouguer was arrested in Paris and charged with fraud. The French police raided his studio and found the explicit mechanical proof of his deception.
They found the double exposure plates. They found a decapitated mannequin and a box full of fake heads and beards that he used to stage the ghosts.
And confronted with this overwhelming physical evidence, Bouguer fully confessed in a court of law to faking the photographs.
You have the physical props, you have the exposed glass plates, you have the man's own sworn confession. How does William Stainton Moses, a highly educated clergyman and leader of the Ghost Club, react to this indisputable proof?
He refused to accept it. Moses publicly argued that the police had coerced Bugay's confession. He claimed that Bugay was actually a genuine medium, but perhaps malevolent trickster spirits had materialized the fake dummy heads in the studio to frame him.
He literally invents a conspiracy theory about evil spirits, framing a photographer to avoid admitting he was conned. The mental gymnastics are staggering. But it highlights a pattern that we see repeat over and over, not just in the history of the paranormal, but in modern human psychology. That's like modern confirmation bias, right?
Exactly. It's the ultimate manifestation of cognitive dissonance. When a true believer encounters hard, irrefutable evidence that destroys their core belief, the psychological pain of admitting they were foolish is too great.
So they construct increasingly bizarre rationalizations to preserve the belief. We see this deeply ingrained need to believe manifest later with another legendary member of the Ghost Club, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats.
Yeats was a Nobel laureate, an undisputed literary genius, but he was also deeply immersed in the occult. He and his wife practiced automatic writing obsessively for years.
They weren't just dabbling. They claimed to be communicating with complex entities they called instructors. Yeats took the results of his wife's automatic writing sessions so seriously that he used them to construct a massive esoteric book detailing a bizarre cosmological system.
Looking at figures like Crookes, Moses, and Yeats shatters a very persistent illusion we hold about human intelligence. We desperately want to believe that highly educated, brilliant people operate as perfect, rational machines.
We think raw IQ is a shield against deception. But the Ghost Club proves that extreme intelligence just makes you better at building complex, articulate defenses for your own irrational beliefs. It's confirmation bias on steroids. Today, we see people twisting themselves into logical knots to protect a political ideology or a pseudoscientific health trend when presented with contrary data.
The deeply uncomfortable psychological truth here is that highly educated people don't always follow the evidence where it leads, especially when the evidence threatens something they desperately need to be true.
And there is no better, no more heartbreaking example of that desperate, blinding need than the most famous paradox in the history of the club, Arthur Conan Doyle.
We must return to the creator of Sherlock Holmes.
I really want to emphasize the profound irony of this. Conan Doyle didn't just invent a popular character, he engineered the definitive blueprint for the modern, hyper-rational mind. Sherlock Holmes is modeled entirely on empirical observation.
Conan Doyle famously modeled Holmes on his old medical school professor, Dr. Joseph Bell, who championed extreme deductive reasoning. Conan Doyle understood the mechanics of skepticism perfectly. He wrote the manual on it.
And yet, the man who possessed the capacity to engineer that hyper-rational fictional brain was, in his real life, one of the most credulous, easily manipulated men in England when it came to the supernatural.
The climax of that credulity, the moment that permanently scarred his legacy, happened in 1920, with the event we mentioned at the start, the Cottingley fairies.
The story of Cottingley is a masterclass in how desire overrides perception. So in 1917, two young cousins, 16-year-old Elsie Wright and 9-year-old Frances Griffiths, living in the small English village of Cottingley, borrowed a simple camera.
They went down to a stream behind their house and they took a series of photographs. And when the plates were developed, they appeared to show these two young girls sitting in the grass, surrounded by literal small winged fairies.
To be clear, these were not ambiguous, blurry smears of light. They were clear, defined, two-dimensional humanoids with butterfly wings playing musical instruments.
The photographs eventually make their way into the hands of Arthur Conan Doyle. He is looking for material for an article he has been commissioned to write on fairies for the Strand magazine.
He looks at these photographs, and the architect of Sherlock Holmes doesn't laugh. He doesn't look for the strings. He believes they are completely, undeniably real.
He went far beyond private belief. He had the photos examined by experts who declared they hadn't been tampered with, meaning they weren't double exposures, ignoring the possibility that the objects in the photo were simply fake props.
Conan Doyle staked his towering international reputation on them. He published his article presenting the Cottingley fairies to the world as objective scientific proof of a parallel, magical evolution of life.
And the ultimate truth behind the photographs, the reality that fooled the greatest deductive mind of the era, is almost heartbreaking in its simplicity.
Decades later, in the 1980s, the girls, now elderly women, finally admitted exactly how they pulled it off.
There was no complex darkroom manipulation. There was no esoteric illusion. The fairies were literal illustrations that the girls had found in a popular children's book.
They had simply traced the drawings, cut them out of stiff paper with scissors, prop them up in the grass using long hat pins, and taken a picture.
Paper cutouts and hat pins. When you hear that, it is so incredibly easy to laugh at Conan Doyle, to look back with a century of hindsight and say, how could someone be so profoundly stupid?
But I really want to ask you listening to withhold that laughter. Because when you peel back the layers and examine the why his brilliant mind refused to see the paper edges, you don't find stupidity. You find an absolute crushing human tragedy.
To understand the Cottingley failure, we must look at the specific, unbearable context of Arthur Conan Doyle's life in 1920. The First World War had just decimated the continent, and the war did not spare Conan Doyle.
His losses are staggering. He lost his eldest son, Kingsley, who was severely wounded at the Battle of the Somme, and subsequently died of pneumonia during the Spanish flu pandemic. He lost his beloved brother, Innes. He lost 2 brothers-in-law. He lost 2 nephews.
He is a man utterly drowning in an ocean of senseless, premature death.
He is carrying a level of grief that the human mind is barely equipped to process. And in that state of profound psychological devastation, extreme intelligence is absolutely no shield against self-deception. In fact, his intelligence became the engine of his delusion.
When your heart is entirely broken by the cold, rational, material reality that your son is dead, you develop an overwhelming cellular need for there to be a flaw in that material reality.
You desperately need there to be something beyond the rational. Conan Doyle looked at those paper fairies, and his grief essentially hijacked his optic nerve. He needed the fairies to be real.
Because if fairies are real, then the strict materialist worldview of the scientific establishment is wrong. And if materialism is wrong, then magic is real. And if magic is real, then the soul exists. And if the soul exists, then death is not the end.
If the fairies are real, his son is still out there somewhere. The Cottingley fairies weren't a failure of Conan Doyle's intellect. They were a direct measurement of his broken heart.
And that intense, desperate human need to transcend mortality explains every single failure of the Ghost Club. It explains why a brilliant chemist like Crookes fell for a teenager pretending to be Katie King. It explains why William Stainton Moses ignored a fraudster's confession.
But crucially, that same human need also explains the club's beautiful, enduring persistence. The deep desire to know that we are not merely meat and bone, the hope that some vital spark survives the dark that is arguably the most fundamental human impulse.
And it is an impulse that has not been extinguished by time or progress.
Which brings the timeline right up to the present day. Because the most surprising fact about the Ghost Club isn't its Victorian origins. It's the fact that the club still exists.
It operates in the United Kingdom to this very day. It has evolved significantly from that foggy, clandestine room in 1862. It is no longer a secret society of panic academics, terrified of the Royal Society.
They accept skeptics, scientists, historians, and people who are just genuinely curious about the unknown.
Yeah.
And thankfully, they admit women now, having dropped the archaic rules of Victorian fraternity.
The highly secretive Brother Ghost moniker has been retired to the history books.
The modern iterations of paranormal investigators utilize tools that Charles Dickens couldn't have even conceptualized. They walk into supposedly haunted locations armed with digital audio recorders, full-spectrum infrared cameras, electromagnetic field meters, and thermal imaging devices.
But despite all of that, despite well over a century of explosive technological advancement, despite mapping the human genome, splitting the atom, and putting rovers on Mars, the founding question of the Ghost Club remains exactly as unanswered today as it was in 1862.
The archival cases still accumulate, but the evidence produced by the thermal cameras and the digital recorders remains exactly what it was for Dickens investigating table rapping. Deeply, frustratingly inconclusive. We have infinitely better technology, but we have not captured a ghost.
And yet, looking back at the long, messy history of this club, I find a profound comfort in that exact inconclusiveness.
There is a strange, enduring peace in realizing that the most rigorous, brilliant minds of the Victorian age, the men who built the foundations of our modern scientific world, sat down in a room, stared at the greatest, most terrifying mystery of human existence, and honestly said, "We don't know, but we are looking."
They refused to pretend they had all the answers. They accepted the weight of the unknown. They recognized that the search itself has value, even if the destination remains forever obscured.
So what does this massive history mean for us today? I want to leave you with a final thought, a scenario for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think about that powerful intersection of high-end science and the desperate, visceral human need to believe.
It's a potent combination.
Imagine if a brand new modern-day ghost club were formed tonight by the world's top scientists. Let's say it was populated by the top theoretical physicists, neuroscientists, and structural engineers.
Okay.
And let's say we equip them with every single piece of modern, cutting-edge technology we currently possess: artificial intelligence, pattern recognition, quantum sensors, particle accelerators, the works. If we sent those brilliant modern minds into the dark to look for the dead, would all of our pristine technology actually change the outcome?
Or would our modern griefs, our modern biases, and our deep, unyielding emotional blind spots still lead us to see exactly what we desperately want to see in the data?
It forces us to ask whether technological progress can ever truly override the fundamental architecture of human psychology. When the lights go out and the room gets cold, are we really truly any less haunted than the Victorians sitting around that candlelit table? Keep that in mind the next time you hear a strange bump in the night or catch a shadow moving out of the corner of your eye. Until next time.